The Eldritch plot sat just beyond the weeping ash trees of Harrowick Cemetery, not marked by grandeur but by eerie repetition. 13 graves in a perfect horseshoe, all chiseled from the same gray-veined stone, each bearing the same delicate serifed script, each with a date of birth and a death, but nothing in between. No epitaphs, no symbols of faith, no quotes about peace or love or eternity. Just names. And those names, if you watched over the years, kept multiplying. Locals noticed first with quiet confusion and then with something colder. There were no funeral processions, no hearses, no open caskets, no distant relatives arriving by train, no black dresses drifting behind drawn veils, no flowers left to die in their vases. The earth was freshly turned, the stones were newly carved, but no one saw the bodies arrive. The undertaker kept his mouth shut, and the church kept no record of burials, and still, the stones kept coming. The oldest was Charles Eldritch, 1832 to 1889. The newest was Margaret Ann Eldritch, 1912 to 1931. In 42 years, the plot had filled without ever gathering a crowd. The soil was always just a little damp, even in drought. Some said the ground rejected rest. Others said it was the fault of the well that sat too close, its water strange with the taste of iron. A boy once dared to touch one of the stones at dusk and claimed it hummed under his palm. His hand trembled for days, and his mother made him sleep with the windows closed. She never explained why. The town doctor, a man named Bellamy, had once kept track of death certificates and noted the pattern. Almost no Eldritch deaths were signed by him or any other practicing physician. Most were labeled natural causes or declared deceased by kin. The handwriting always the same, the ink always rust-colored. Bellamy brought it up to the sheriff once, then retracted his question. His ledger disappeared the next week. When asked about it years later, his only reply was that some things end you long before you're in the ground. The Eldritch house itself stood at the top of Widow's Rise, just visible from the cemetery's edge, always with one curtain drawn, always with a single lamp glowing in the upper west window, no matter the hour. No laughter came from that house, no arguments either. Just a hollow stillness, like it had swallowed its own sound. Mail was delivered but never retrieved in view. The milk was left and then gone by morning with no trace of footsteps in the dew. The children, when there were children, were not seen past age 12. Each vanished into the house like a thread tucked behind a stitch. If they passed away, no teacher was told. If they fell ill, no doctor was called. They were, as the town came to believe, born to vanish. And yet Harrowick carried on. People stopped asking. They learned to look away from Widow's Rise. They let the stones grow quietly like weeds no one dared pull. Some believed it was simply a family, cursed with grief too private for the world. Others whispered of old rituals, of a belief passed down like a sickness, where silence was sacred and sorrow was best served unseen. But beneath the rumors, beneath the church bells and market chatter, something darker brewed. The sense that these deaths were not mourned because they were not losses. That each grave marked not the end of life, but the fulfillment of something ancient, patient, and deliberate. And the soil kept soft, always waiting. The undertaker's name was Lowell Finch, a quiet man with hands like bark and a gaze that never fully lifted from the ground. He had buried half of Harrowick over the course of 37 years, and in that time he'd learned that the earth tells its own stories. It sinks, it shifts, it grows still when it's at peace. But the Eldritch plot was different. The soil above those graves never settled. He first noticed it after the burial of Elise Eldritch in 1892. 3 days after placing her casket in the ground, he returned to find the earth soft again, as if someone had stirred it with their hands. There were no signs of tampering, no footprints, no animals digging. just a strange looseness to the topsoil as if the grave rejected closure. He tamped it down again, watching the dirt buckle under the weight of his shovel, but the feeling lingered, like he was packing something alive. Lowell didn't speak of it then. He had children to feed and a mortgage on the edge of widow's rise. But with each new burial, his dread grew. He recorded the phenomenon in a private ledger, one he kept hidden beneath a false bottom in his desk drawer. He wrote about Charles Eldritch's grave splitting down the center after a thunderstorm, even though the rest of the cemetery remained untouched. He described the faint smell of iron and milk that sometimes rose from the soil after a fresh interment. He noted how the grass over the Eldritch plot refused to root, how it grew in patches that curled like fingers instead of blades. The journal entries grew darker when he began hearing what he called the pulling sound, like damp cloth tearing slowly from beneath the grave. He wrote that once, just before dusk, he saw a worm-like shape shift under the dirt, thick as a child's wrist, and vanish as if inhaled. He began assigning younger men to the Eldritch burials, claiming his knees were failing. But he always stayed near, watching, listening. Sometimes pacing the gravel path between the plot and the chapel, pretending to light a pipe he never smoked. Once, in 1910, he tried to dig one back up. A test, he said in his journal, though he never clarified what he expected to find. He stopped after only 4 feet when his spade hit something that wasn't wood, or stone, or bone. He described it as a soft resistance, like striking a lung that was still breathing. He filled the hole and vomited behind the chapel. The next morning, he found that the grave had risen again, unnaturally rounded like a shallow dome. He never returned to it. In 1919, after the last Eldritch stone appeared, he sealed the journal and left it to be found only after his death. He instructed his daughter to burn everything in his drawer except the envelope marked with an inked crescent and the words, "Let them decide." When the envelope was opened decades later by a new pastor converting the cemetery office into a youth study room, the pages were brittle, but the writing clear. The journal did not accuse. It did not name a crime. But it spoke of dread like a man speaks of love he can't explain. Long, quiet, unavoidable. The soil, Lowell wrote, was never still because something beneath it never wanted rest. It was not grief. It was something else. Something fed with rhythm. The ground didn't mourn. It remembered. Agnes Eldritch was not the kind of woman people approached with idle questions. She moved like a shadow that knew where it belonged, always on the edge of vision, always just outside the warmth of a room. Her long black dresses swept the dirt paths of Harrowick years before any of her children passed, though no one dared ask why. At first, the town chalked it up to grief that wouldn't fade. They believed she'd lost someone long ago and never recovered, or perhaps she was simply touched by melancholy in that way certain women were allowed to be if they kept quiet and raised their children. But Agnes never spoke of loss, and her face did not carry sadness. Her eyes were steady, her posture exact, and her silence was never soft. Her black sleeves were not wilted with mourning. They were pressed like uniforms, her collars stiff as if for ceremony. No one knew that the fabric marked a decision, not a death. Inside the Eldritch home, Agnes kept to a pattern so precise it made visitors uncomfortable. Breakfast was served at 6:01, even if the sun hadn't yet risen. Doors were opened and closed on counts of 7. Meals were plated in specific colors. Red on Thursdays, blue on Sundays, bone white for all others. Her children obeyed without question, but something deeper than obedience lived in their eyes. Agnes would stop mid-sentence if one of them sneezed and simply stare until the child froze. They never sneezed twice. She watched each of them like a gardener deciding which flower to cut, not out of cruelty, but because the design demanded it. Her journals, found much later sealed in beeswax beneath a loose stair, described the world as a canvas and her family as the strokes required to complete it. She believed beauty was only possible through subtraction, what she called the purification of form. Her black clothing was not a mourning garment, it was the uniform of the one who chooses. When her son Isaac began stuttering, she laid out a black shawl on her sewing table and wore it the next morning. When her daughter June began waking from sleep with her eyes still rolling, Agnes stitched black gloves and wore them by dusk. When the youngest Nora sang out of key at the chapel, Agnes pressed a black brooch into her collar and left it there until the day Nora vanished. The black was not grief. It was a signal, a preparation. She believed that death, when it was chosen, must be acknowledged ahead of time, so the spirit could organize its departure and not resist. She wore black to tell the house, the soil, the air itself that the balance was about to be corrected. The neighbors never saw her weep, not once. Even as the stones multiplied in the family plot, she remained dry-eyed and composed, nodding politely to anyone who dared cross her path. Some assumed the loss had shattered her too deeply for tears. Others whispered that she'd never loved them at all, but neither was true. Agnes believed in something older than love, a kind of order that demanded precise obedience, not affection. To her, choosing who would be mourned before they died was not madness. It was clarity. In her mind, death was not something that came. It was something summoned, and she, wrapped in black before the first cough, the first limp, the first nosebleed, was merely following the ritual to its perfect end. The chapel behind the Eldritch estate stood with no name and no altar, built of pale stone that never seemed to gather dust and never seemed to crack. Behind it, tucked into a narrow grove of dead elms, hung a bell suspended from a rusted wooden beam. It was called the Hollow Bell, though it had no visible flaw. From a distance it looked like any other, iron and quiet, wrapped in moss and age. But those who passed too close claimed it made their fingers twitch without warning. Some felt it in the spine, others in the jaw. It never rang in any traditional sense. It never moved in wind or storm. But the bell was real, and it was used. Agnes Eldritch rang it before each death. Only once. Only when the selection had already been made. There was no rope, no clapper. Just her palm pressed flat against the metal's base. The contact was silent, but the effect was not. Inside the house, children stopped mid-motion, eyes glassy, limbs still. Across the field, birds scattered without sound. Even the dogs in town refused to bark on the nights it happened. One boy who trespassed near the chapel swore he felt the ringing in his teeth, like a fork dragged across bone. He never returned, and years later his mother found a sketchbook beneath his mattress, pages filled with shaking outlines of a bell and mouths drawn shut with thread. The ritual was older than Agnes, passed down from the Eldritch line and never spoken of beyond their walls. In her journals, she described it not as an act of mourning, but as a call to correction. She believed that when a child or spouse or cousin failed to hold the necessary shape, whether in behavior, expression, or thought, their internal rhythm disrupted the family's structure. She called it fracture. The bell was not punishment. It was recalibration. She wrote that sound was too coarse a tool to reach the spirit. True correction required silence, perfect, unbroken, seeping into the blood. The bell's vibration, she claimed, resonated just beneath the sternum where the mind could not argue. It softened resistance. It opened the door. What followed was always the same. Within 3 days of the bell being touched, the selected family member would fall ill or vanish or perish in some quiet way. One choked on broth. Another collapsed while reading. One was simply found asleep and did not wake. No screams were heard. No struggle ever observed. Agnes never administered medicine, never summoned help. She sat beside them, her hands folded, waiting for the stillness to arrive. It always did, but the silence didn't end with death. It spread like a sickness through the house. Doors stopped creaking. Floors gave no protest underfoot. The clocks were always wound but never ticked. The children who remained did not speak of the bell. In truth, they couldn't. The ringing took more than life. It took recollection. Survivors blinked like sleepwalkers, their voices delayed by seconds, their memories eaten at the edges. One boy, when grown and sent to a sanatorium for his trembling, tried to draw the bell from memory. He managed only a blank circle surrounded by tiny hands pressed to ears. The bell still hangs there, untouched by rust. When the estate was emptied, no one dared remove it. No record of it was found in town archives. The chapel itself collapsed one winter, but the beam that held the bell did not fall. Some say it wasn't built to stand but planted, and the bell was not hung, but grown. Whatever the truth, it remains. And on windless nights when all is quiet, the air along Widow's Rise seems to hum, not loud, not sharp, but just enough to make the bones remember what was lost in silence. The bodies of the Eldritch family confounded every mortician who dared inspect them. They were never embalmed, never prepared in the ways others were, yet they did not rot. Even days after death, their skin held color, their limbs moved without stiffness, and their mouths stayed shut, not sewn, not forced, just closed in a way that felt intentional. When one of the distant county officials ordered an exhumation in 1917, citing legal irregularities in death documentation, 3 graves were opened. What they found ended the investigation before it could even begin. The first coffin held Margaret Ann Eldritch, reported dead at 19. Her hands were folded neatly, her face serene, but her throat, when the examiner made the first incision, rang like metal. Beneath her skin was an iron cast, not placed but fused, welded along the edges of the windpipe, running from jaw to collarbone. The mold had no seams, no attachment points. It appeared to have been formed from within, as though her final breath had solidified into steel. The second coffin, belonging to her uncle Elias, revealed the same. His sternum had been cracked deliberately to allow placement of what looked like a branching funnel. 4 iron prongs pressed outward against his ribs, ending in smooth, rounded caps like soft hammers. It wasn't surgical, it wasn't crude either. It looked ritualistic, made to fit the shape of his internal scream and hold it there forever. The iron was warm to the touch even after hours in the cold. Not electrically, not chemically. Just warm, like it remembered something the body couldn't tell. One coroner fled halfway through the second examination. The report filed simply read, "Unnatural preservation, abnormal structures noted, recommend immediate reburial." No charges were filed, no questions were pursued. But one of the medical assistants stole photographs before the caskets were returned to the soil. He showed them years later, shaking, to a journalist who wrote for a fringe paper. The photos were grainy, but the shapes were real. Iron lattices inside human necks, smooth and unnatural, as if grown by the body to contain something too large to pass through voice. The article was never published. The assistant was later found drowned in 3 inches of water, his throat black with rust. Agnes Eldritch had written about the throat in one of her sealed bone journals. She called it the cage of failure and claimed that it must be replaced in those who spoke beyond their role. Her belief, twisted as it was, centered on control of speech, of emotion, of ritual timing. She wrote that when someone in the family fractured the silence with pain or protest or question, their throat betrayed the order. She believed the air they expelled became contaminated and could carry disorder through the house like a scent. The iron, she said, was not punishment but containment. It ensured that even after death, the voice remained captive. No records explain how the molds were made or inserted. No one in Harrowick ever recalled hearing screams, but several neighbors claimed that on certain nights after an Eldritch death, they woke to a dull clanging, not from tools or hammering, but from beneath the earth, as if metal was being formed in silence, shaped by pressure, sealed with breath. One farmer said he felt it in the handle of his shovel. Another said his dog barked at the ground and would not stop until dawn. None of them went near the Eldritch plot again, and the graves, once disturbed, sank lower than before, as if the soil knew they had been opened and sought to pull them deeper, where the iron could rest without witness. Tobias Eldritch was last seen in public at the age of 9, walking stiffly beside Agnes during a rare appearance at the town chapel. He didn't speak, didn't blink often, and kept one hand pressed to his chest the entire time. The neighbors assumed he was sickly or simply withdrawn, like many of the Eldritch children before him. But then he vanished entirely. No school, records, no church listings, no mention of illness or burial. His name wasn't carved into the family plot. At first, no one noticed. By then, Harrowick had learned not to ask about children who stopped appearing. But years later, during a renovation of a state-run sanitarium 50 miles east, a nurse came forward with something she hadn't been able to explain since 1914. Her story was quiet, trembling, told in the back room of a home for retired staff. She spoke of a boy who had no name, no file, no arrival record. He had been placed in a windowless room and moved only at night, always under sheets, never by stretcher. His limbs were delicate, wrapped in gauze, and he refused to make eye contact. She remembered his back most clearly. She said it was covered in thin, papery skin that peeled off in wide, clean sheets every few weeks. The sheets were saved in a locked drawer. She described them as smooth to the touch and curled at the edges like old parchment. And each one was covered in writing. It wasn't the child's writing. It wasn't medical notes. It was cursive, fluid, meticulous. It matched, down to every loop and cross, the known script of Agnes Eldritch from her preserved journals. The sentences were incomplete, fragmented, obsessive. One read, "The vessel resists, but the pages must be replaced." Another, "No name should last longer than its use." One had only 2 words, repeated over and over down the entire sheet. "With permission." When the staff asked what he remembered, the boy said nothing, but his body would react to certain sounds. A bell in the hallway, the snap of leather gloves, the creak of wooden beams. He would curl into himself, shiver not from cold but from rhythm. One nurse tried to bathe him and found the water around him darkened not with blood but with ink. When she drained the tub, the stains formed rings like tree growth, layered, expanding from where he had sat. They burned the tub. They never filed a report. The boy remained in the sanitarium for 6 years, then disappeared. No exit records, no transfer, just gone. A maintenance worker claimed to find a sheet of peeled skin wedged behind a wall panel years later, though it was too brittle to preserve. The ink on it had one message: "Return him to the house when the words run out." What remained of the staff avoided the story after that. Most refused to say his name, even when presented with photographs. But one, a night nurse who had joined just before the boy vanished, said she remembered a phrase written across his left forearm in small, trembling script. "This one is not to be buried. This one is to remember." She said he would look at the wall when she read it aloud, as if waiting for something to reply. There was never confirmation the boy was Tobias, but the Eldritch census listed him as present until 1921, years after his last sighting in Harrowick. Then his name was simply marked through with a line, and in the U margin, a single note in familiar ink: "Form unstable." The graveyard never received a stone. The soil remained undisturbed, And the house, for the first time in decades, left one upstairs window cracked open through winter, as if something was expected to return before it dried completely. The Eldritch garden was never meant for beauty. It bore no fruit, no vegetables, no climbing vines or resting benches. Just a flat patch of soil packed too tight for seeds to take root, ringed by stone markers that bore no names. Agnes claimed it was for meditation, a place for silence. But it held a weight that repelled footsteps. Even birds avoided its edge. One spring, a visitor named Eliza Marnay, cousin to a distant branch of the family, came to stay for 3 nights. On the second evening, while walking alone near the garden just after dusk, she paused at the center and stood still for nearly 10 minutes. She later wrote in her journal that she had heard humming, not from the house, not from the trees, but from beneath the soil itself. It was soft and low, the pitch uneven like many small voices trying to match a tune they didn't know. The sound disappeared when she called for someone. No one believed her. Agnes dismissed it with a smile. The family doctor offered sedatives. Eliza left before sunrise the next day, leaving her suitcase behind. The story faded until a town ordinance forced the grounds behind the Eldritch house to be surveyed decades later, after the estate was turned over to the county. When crews arrived to mark property lines, one worker struck something hard and smooth less than 2 feet below the surface. They believed it was a pipe or tile. What they uncovered instead was a shallow grave, no coffin, no lining, no shroud. Just a pile of small bones arranged in a perfect arc, like an audience seated in pews. The skulls were infant-sized, some no larger than a fist, all with mouths agape. But the mouths were not open naturally. Each had been sealed in mid-expression by a pale yellow wax, molded into oval shapes that locked the jaw in song. The wax had held. Even after years in the soil, the structure was intact. Some of the skulls showed signs of surgical separation along the base. One had the words "harmonic breach" carved lightly along the upper jaw, too shallow for decay to erase. The county coroner refused to issue a report. The bones were labeled ritual remains and transferred to an unlisted archive. But one photograph slipped through, smuggled by a volunteer who would later claim nightmares of weeping without sound. The image showed 11 skulls, each facing slightly upward, each angled toward the garden's center. Beneath the wax, the mouths were not screaming. They were shaped into precise vowels, as if caught mid-hymn. A music historian brought in for consultation studied the curvature of the lips and declared them to match a choral pattern, a repeating tone used in funerary rites from ancient monastic orders. He asked if any throat bones had been preserved. None had, only the mouths. Agnes's journals, long hidden in hollow floorboards, made several references to the garden as a chamber of tuning. She believed that grief made noise, and that noise disrupted the order she had built. Infants, she wrote, were born full of unsorted resonance. To her, they were not yet clean, not yet aligned. The wax was not cruelty, it was correction. She called it sealing the pre-sound, a step she claimed necessary before a name could be properly removed from the world. She never named the infants. They were not recorded in any family ledger, not marked on any headstone. But in the garden, their presence lingered. Even after the bones were taken and the grave resealed, one groundskeeper refused to step inside the ring. He said his knees trembled there like he was standing on a note that hadn't finished playing. And some nights, if the wind passed just right through the dead elm trees, the soil seemed to hum. Not loud, not mournful, but in perfect unison. The hearth in the Eldritch sitting room had not been lit for decades. The bricks were too smooth, the iron too polished, the logs always stacked but never scorched. The fireplace was ornamental, Agnes once claimed, meant for symmetry, not warmth. But when state assessors entered the home after its abandonment, They noted something strange. The wall behind the hearth echoed differently, as if space had been hollowed and refilled. When they removed the back panel, they found a hidden chamber, barely large enough to hold a child crouched. Inside, on a shallow shelf, lay 13 flat bones arranged in a precise spiral, bleached and carved with letters so fine they shimmered like threads. It was not writing at first glance. It looked like scratches, animal marks, random patterns. But under angled light, the carvings formed words, sentences, thoughts. It was a journal, etched into bone, and it belonged to Clara Eldritch. Clara had been 15 the last time anyone in town saw her. She was different from the others, louder, sharper, sometimes seen at the library asking about subjects Agnes never allowed in the house. She once stole a map. Another time she asked a teacher about the human nervous system, then never returned. The family claimed she had gone to live with a distant aunt for rest. But the school received no transfer records. No letters ever arrived. Clara vanished and no one challenged it. The Eldritch house had a way of closing around its missing pieces like skin around a scar. Until the bones were found, each bone, most of them rib or shoulder blade, was scraped smooth and sharpened at the edge like paper. Clara had used a needle or claw to carve her thoughts, cutting deep enough to bleed the truth, shallow enough to avoid cracking the surface. She wrote that pain was language in her family, a form of translation used to remove sound. She described rituals not as punishments but as edits, moments where the body was corrected, refined, turned inward. She believed Agnes saw silence not as absence but as purity, a state where nothing could contaminate the shape of obedience. Clara wrote that every child was trained to fear their own voice, that even crying in sleep was treated like disease. When a child wept, Agnes would place a candle beside their bed and record how long it flickered. Longer flickers meant stronger resistance. Stronger resistance meant the child would be next. Clara admitted she had tried to fake compliance. She held her breath during sleep. She whispered prayers with her mouth closed. But one night she found a symbol carved into the underside of her pillowcase, a circle with 13 notches, the same shape later found pressed into the bones of the stillborn choir. She wrote that this meant she had been chosen, that the cycle had found her. But she refused to disappear quietly. The final bone in the spiral held only 3 lines. I will not go cold. I will not be waxed. If you find this, I broke the pattern and then nothing. Her body was never recovered. No fresh grave appeared. But one of the attic beams was found split from within, claw marks embedded in the wood. The initials CE were etched into the inside corner backwards as if carved from the wrong side of the timber. Investigators reported the marks but never followed up. The room was sealed again. The bones were taken. But the silence Clara fought against still hummed in the house. Some say the hearth burns now without fuel when no one is looking. Others say the spiral of bones was a map, an attempt not just to confess but to show the path out. But no one followed it. Not then. Not yet. The house kept her silence, and the rest followed. The men who married into the Eldritch family were always quiet. Not by nature, but by transformation. In the beginning, they were ordinary teachers, shopkeepers, one a traveling pianist. They smiled in wedding photos, though none were ever framed in the house. They signed their names beside Agnes's daughters in thin church ledgers. Then they vanished from town, not all at once, but each in their own quiet arc. None of them were buried in the Eldritch plot, yet everyone was declared dead by Agnes herself. No investigation followed. She claimed they had died naturally or been sent to sanatoriums. In time, no one questioned it. That changed in 1926 when a deep frost thawed early and pushed a coffin from the bank of Harrowick Creek, just downstream from the Eldritch property line. It was old, unmarked, sealed with resin and iron clasps. When the coroner opened it, he found a man's body dressed in wedding clothes that had grown stiff with time, his mouth forced open in a grimace that did not seem caused by death. Inside his jaw were copper teeth. They were not crowns. They were not fillings. The copper had been shaped into small blunt molars and hammered into the sides of his lower jaw, through the bone, through the gum line, angled not for chewing but for pressure. The roots had fused to the bone like the metal had grown there. There was no surgical precision, just forced symmetry, deliberate and cruel. The man's original teeth had been removed entirely, not cleanly, but broken off at the root. One was found in his stomach, swallowed or forced down. The others were never recovered. The local doctor said he had never seen anything like it. He quit 2 weeks later, citing an illness he refused to describe. The body was never identified. Agnes declined to claim it, but the man's jawbone was photographed and that image survived. In the years that followed, 3 more bodies were uncovered from surrounding woods and shallow wells, all in states of varying decay, all with copper molars embedded in their jaws. One had them in the roof of his mouth, crushed upward into the sinus cavity. Another had been gagged with melted wax, the teeth pressed into the soft tissue below the tongue, arranged in a half circle. All had no dental records. All had once been reported in town as husbands to Eldritch daughters. Their marriages were brief. Their obituaries, when they existed, were unsigned. Agnes made no public comment. But in her preserved notes beneath the topic of external integration, she wrote a single sentence. Outside blood must carry the mark or it will never digest. Her obsession with control extended beyond the house. She did not trust men who came from elsewhere with laughter in their throats and language not molded by her rhythm. She believed the mouth was the entry point of all disorder. A new husband, left unchecked, could infect the structure of the family, contaminate the silence with emotion, with foreign memory. The copper teeth, in her view, were not torture. They were correction. A forced restructuring of the body so that it could no longer express what it had not been shaped to understand. The bodies were reburied under state orders far from Harrowick. But in a box beneath the attic floorboards, investigators found a row of teeth, human and copper, stored in labeled jars. Each jar bore a name. Each name matched a missing man. Some of the copper had turned green, some remained polished, as if untouched by time. One jar was still warm. The house was emptied that year. But on certain nights, if the wind shifted just right, a metallic scent drifted from the ground behind the house, sharp and sour like blood boiled in old pennies. And the trees around the garden leaned slightly inward, as if listening for what could no longer be spoken. The nursery at Eldritch House had no windows and only one door, bolted from the outside with a brass rod engraved in a pattern too fine for the eye to follow. It was the only room on the second floor without a key, the only one never mentioned in any floor plan or family record. For decades, its presence was denied. Guests were told it was a storage room, sealed for insulation. Maids were forbidden to sweep near it. Children, if they asked, were told it was where bad air settled. But when the state took possession of the house in 1932 and began formal clearing, the room could no longer be ignored. A crew of 4 men broke the bolt. It took longer than expected. The metal had fused into the wood like it had grown roots. When the door finally opened, they found the nursery untouched by time, untouched by light. The air smelled of old iron and cedar oil, and hanging from the ceiling, suspended by black ribbon, were 16 dolls. They were not placed. They were arranged, spaced evenly in a perfect arc, each one turning slowly as if drifting in a current too faint to feel. The dolls were made of pale fabric, hand-stitched, faceless except for faint lines sewn where mouths should have been. Their hands were drawn up near their chests, palms open as if frozen mid-offering. One man tried to lift a doll from its ribbon. It fell apart in his hands. What spilled out wasn't cotton or straw. It was teeth, hundreds of them, raw, unpolished, some still carrying fragments of jawbone or gum. Molars, canines, and incisors, none matching in size or age. They clattered across the floor in a sound that didn't echo, like the room itself refused to carry it. The other dolls, when inspected, were found to be filled with the same. No notes, no names, no explanation. Later dental analysis showed that many of the teeth came from children under 5. Some had never broken through the gum. Others were adult-sized, cracked at the root. The enamel bore strange discoloration, stains and patterns rather than blotches, like symbols burned into the structure. One tooth had a spiral etched along the inner cusp. Another had been filed down to resemble a bell. None of the teeth were recorded in any hospital or morgue inventory. None were claimed. They had not been preserved. They had been hidden. Agnes, according to surviving writings, believed that grief must be processed physically. She wrote that when a child's pain was too much to bear in the body, it must be lifted out and softened, then stored in something innocent. The dolls, she said, were vessels of deferred harm, containers that kept the house quiet by holding what the children could not be allowed to express. There was no bedding in the nursery, no chairs, just a single drawer built into the wall, locked from the inside. When it was forced open, it revealed 16 birth certificates, none matching Eldritch family records. Some were from other counties. One had been reported missing from a burned orphanage nearly 30 years prior. All bore one detail in common. The word infant was scratched out, replaced in ink with carrier. The paper smelled faintly of teeth dust, dry and mineral-rich. An archivist refused to handle it bare-handed. Another fainted while transcribing. No one stayed in the nursery more than 10 minutes. After the third team member collapsed, the room was sealed again. Boards were nailed over the door. The bolt was replaced. But something had already shifted in the air. For weeks after, neighbors claimed to hear rattling through the pipes at night, not water, not rust, but the sound of something small and loose tumbling without end. And behind the sealed door, the black ribbons continued to sway even when no air moved. As if the dolls remembered what had been placed inside them and still waited to be chosen. Margaret Eldritch was declared dead at 16. The death notice was written in Agnes's handwriting, signed by a church elder who no longer remembered doing so. No burial service was held, but a stone appeared in the family plot within 3 days. Small, plain, the same gray-veined marble used for every other name. No one saw a casket, no one heard weeping. But the town accepted it, as they always did, because by then death in the Eldritch family came quietly, without resistance, like furniture being rearranged when no one was looking. Margaret's name was removed from the school roll. Her desk emptied overnight. But what followed fractured the story. 3 years later, a substitute teacher sorting through archived attendance sheets found Margaret's signature on every daily roster for the year following her supposed death. The handwriting was consistent, the ink fresh, the dates never missed. Her final exam was completed in full. Her notes, kept in spiral-bound books with floral borders, appeared to continue even past graduation. Pages filled with copied passages from household manuals and anatomical sketches. No corrections, no personality, just copied language in perfect lines. The teacher dismissed it at first, believing it a clerical mistake or prank, until the photo surfaced. It was taken 5 years after Margaret's funeral during a statewide health inspection of Harrowick High. The image showed a group of students lined in 3 rows facing forward. Most squinted in the sun. One did not. In the center of the back row stood a girl in a black dress, shoulders pulled tightly inward, her arms hanging at unnatural angles, as if she were resisting movement rather than frozen in it. Her face was unchanged from her last known portrait, the same jawline, the same sunken eyes, the same braided hair that never seemed to fray. But it was her mouth that silenced the room. Her lips were drawn into a smile, not wide, not forced, but sealed, stitched together with fine black thread that wrapped from cheek to cheek in 7 perfect loops. The stitches were not makeup. They cast real shadows. One student, when questioned decades later, claimed she sat beside the girl during that assembly. He said she smelled like boiled milk and paper, and that when she turned her head he heard no breath, only a faint crackling, like dried leaves being folded. No explanation was ever given. The school was asked to destroy the photograph. They did not. It was buried, deep in the archives, mislabeled and sealed. But in a margin of one of Margaret's returned assignments, a teacher had written the words, "Voice absent, comprehension intact." Her final test, submitted without a name, scored a perfect 100. Her penmanship remained flawless, her presence impossible. Agnes's journal entries during that time became erratic. One simply read, "She is complete now. She does not leak. She does not fail." There were no entries after that. It was as if Margaret's silence had spread backward, erasing the pages behind her. Some believed she had never truly lived. Others believed she had been reconstructed, built back into obedience by hands that confused ritual with love. But no one asked the real question. If Margaret had died, who had stitched her smile? And if she hadn't, what had been buried in her place? The cellar beneath the Eldritch estate had always been rumored but never confirmed. It was not marked on any blueprint, not mentioned in deeds or town records. The visible cellar, the one shown to inspectors and guests, held only root crates and empty shelves coated in dust. But the true cellar, the one Agnes referred to in a coded ledger as the second breath, was buried behind a false wall, sealed in brick, invisible unless you knew the sequence of knocks required to find the hollow sound beneath. For years after the estate was abandoned, it remained untouched, too deep for casual explorers, too quiet to raise suspicion. But in 1941, when property reassessment laws changed, a team of municipal workers was granted authority to dig below the structure for foundation inspection. What they found was not support beams or piping, it was a chamber. The stairs led nowhere at first, just a tunnel packed with soil and bits of fabric, compressed as if intentionally pressed inward to discourage passage. But deeper still, beneath 2 feet of stone and rusted nails, the earth gave way to air. And in that dark space, barely taller than a man, they found what had no right to exist. The chamber was rounded, not rectangular, shaped like a throat or the inside of a skull. The walls were lined with iron rails and leather cuffs, too narrow for adult limbs, too stretched for children. Bolts had been welded into the floor, anchoring strange harnesses no longer connected to anything. Along one wall sat 3 shelves of journals, unmarked, unbound, the pages coated in oil to resist decay. The writing was Agnes's, every line written as if transcribed under pressure, the ink heavy, words slanted with notes on breath patterns, facial resistance, and internal compliance failures. She recorded how long each subject took to exhale after loss of consciousness. She described the smell of a collapsing lung as sweet at the end. One entry simply read, "The silence must be drawn out like a song." In the center of the room stood the machine. It was shaped like an iron lung, though it bore no manufacturer's mark, no visible source of power. The casing was rounder than standard medical design, less clinical, more sculptural, like it had been made not to heal but to contain. A pipe fed into the back, ending in nothing. No generator was found, no wires. And yet the machine pulsed. It exhaled every 37 seconds with a sound that made the ceiling dust tremble. Not a wheeze, not a hiss. A low rhythmic release, as if someone inside was still breathing but no longer needed air. The front panel bore 13 notches, aligned with no readable pattern, each worn down by what looked like teeth. One investigator tried to open the hatch. It would not budge. Another placed a hand on the metal and recoiled, claiming it felt warm and wet like skin after fever. No body was found, no trace of recent use, and yet the room smelled of sweat and candle ash, as if something had just ended or was about to begin again. One of the team members later confessed that as he stood in the room, his own breathing began to sync with the machine, not consciously, not by choice. He couldn't stop until someone pulled him back upstairs. The journals were seized, the chamber was resealed, the team was reassigned, but late that year, after winter thawed, neighbors claimed to hear a soft hum coming from beneath the ground. Not constant, not aggressive, just enough to suggest something unfinished was waiting. Agnes had written once, in the margin of a torn page, that the body only truly obeys when it forgets it was ever free. That breath is not a rite, but a rhythm, one meant to be taken and returned, until the soul cannot tell the difference. The cellar had no windows, no light, but it breathed even when the house above had long gone cold. The order to demolish the Eldritch estate came in the fall of 1953. Signed by council members who had grown tired of the stories, the superstitions, and the hollow fear that clung to the town like mildew. They called it a blight, a hazard, a relic. The structure had stood too long on silence, and they believed bricks could be broken by law. The machines arrived on a Monday. By noon, they had not made a single cut. The engine of the first crane sputtered once, then collapsed inward with no clear cause. The second machine began to overheat before it touched the walls. One worker claimed the ground shook beneath the tires, though no tremor registered in nearby plots. The men reported dizziness, nosebleeds, sudden confusion. One saw his own name scrawled across the inside of a window pane backwards, in what looked like nail scratches. After 4 days and 3 injuries, the operation was called off. The building would not fall, not by steel, not by fire, so they buried it, quietly, without ceremony. Dirt hauled in from 6 townships was dumped by hand, layer by layer, until the structure was swallowed whole. There was no marker, no fence, no trace left above ground, but nothing grew there, not grass, not moss, not even mold. The land remained hard and colorless, immune to season. Children who wandered too close developed migraines. Dogs refused to bark in that direction. Birds flew wide circles around the property. Some said they could still see the upper chimney when the fog was low enough. Others claimed to hear coughing under the soil when the wind pushed right. But no one returned. No one built. The address was wiped from the map. Even the name Eldritch was struck from local registers. But stories don't obey ordinances. In 1984, during a routine survey of archival boxes sealed after the town hall fire, a clerk opened a steel tin labeled E. Inside was a folded letter sealed in wax that matched no known stamp. It was unsigned, but unmistakably written by Agnes. The ink had not faded. The tone was clinical. She wrote that grief in its natural state was useless. It wandered, it weakened. She believed it must be guided, harvested, bent into shape like wire through skin. Pain, she argued, could be turned into precision. If orchestrated correctly, it would form a kind of music, one that could be repeated, refined, perfected. She described her family not as victims or participants, but as instruments. The house was her theater. The rituals were rehearsals. The funerals were not endings, but final movements in a composition only she could hear. She called the deaths necessary edits. She called the buried children unresolved notes. She believed silence was not the absence of noise, but the sound of everything finally in place. The letter ended with a single sentence that chilled every archivist who read it. When you bury the house, do not forget to bury your breath beside it, else it will find you unfinished. The town sealed the letter again. No interviews were granted. No survivors came forward. Those who had grown up near the house refused to speak even when pressed, and those who remembered its shape no longer trusted their own memory. Something about it had bent with time. Today, the land remains bare. Construction permits are denied without explanation. Sensors fail on approach. And late at night, when the wind carries from the east, some say the ground feels like it's waiting, not for return, but for the next arrangement. Evil, as Agnes believed, was not chaos. It was the failure to complete the pattern. And in her mind, silence was not the end, it was the applause,